If the Cathar heresy caused considerable distress to the medieval Christian Church in the territories later known as southern France, the Church was equally dismayed to find a concurrent aberration taking root there as well. These were the Valdensians, a popular movement theologically very similar to that generated by Francis of Assisi. But Francis was welcomed with open arms, the Valdensians rebuffed. If the Cathars were perceived as a serious threat to the Church on account of their deviation from the themes of Christian doctrine, the Valdensians were regarded as an even more serious threat inasmuch as their teachings and practice were almost identical with the official Church. Unlike the Cathars, this other heresy spread throughout Europe, attracting numerous adherents eager to experience, by active participation, a renewed form of Christianity. The Church ordered the Valdensians to submit. They said it was better to obey God. Conflict loomed. Entrenched in tradition and institutional authority, the official Church prepared to confront Valdensian Europe in the later Middle Ages.
Those who held up the cross of faith and defended official Christian religion were distressed, increasingly distressed, as the Middle Ages wore on to discover dissenters among them, people who didn't hold to the faith in the same way in which they did, or as they thought they should. By the mid-13th century, a group of people called the Valdensians were regarded by some church authorities as being among the most dangerous groups of heretics ever to appear within the confines of Christianity for three reasons. Three reasons why the Valdensians were so feared. Number one, their longevity. By this time they'd been around for 100 years, which is no mean feat when you've got inquisitors chasing you and stakes being planted all over Europe. To survive for 100 years is, well, quite good. A second reason is because it was widespread. It wasn't just limited to a small or a limited geographical area. Valdensians, as I'll point out, were everywhere, or so it seemed. And the third reason why they were feared is because they were mainly Orthodox. Unlike the Cathars, whom you could really hit heresy by throwing a stone into a group, with the Valdensians you really had to dig to find out what was wrong, and that made them all the more insidious. Because when they're really different than we are, then you can spot them and you can combat them. But when their teachings and their lives are similar, and what if it's even superior to the official church, and they're attracting converts and adherents, this worried the church. So the Valdensian heresy. Now, there were different kinds of Valdensians in different places, stressing different emphases. Some of them were openly anti-clerical. On the other hand, there were Valdensians in different places who were not completely anti-clerical and who were willing to negotiate with the official church. So in other words, not all Valdensian doctrine, not all Valdensian ideas come from a single source. May I say, there is diversity within the unity of Valdensianism in the High Middle Ages. Now it's their enemies who called them Valdenses, that they refer to themselves as the poor of Lyon. I want to just digress to say that so many movements in history have been given their names by their enemies. I mean, Christians were first called Christians at Antioch because they were thought to be followers of Jesus Christ, which in this case was accurate. The Hussites, as we'll find out, were named after a single man. The Lollards, well, nobody even knows what that means. The Cathars, they didn't call themselves Cathars. The Lutherans, Luther did not want anyone called by his name. The same to be said for Calvinists and so on. It's no different for the Valdensians. they referred to themselves, as I mentioned, as the poor of Lyon, because they originated in the southern French city of Lyon. Now, their program was basically a tripartite program, a three-part agenda, if you will. First of all, devotional and voluntary poverty. They emphasized this aspect of the apostolic lifestyle. Secondly, they taught and they practiced that preaching should not be restricted to priests, to the professional ministry, if you will, but that all Christians, men and women, shock, horror, and women too, should preach in the vernacular, in the common language, and moreover that scriptures should be in the common language as well. And the third point has to do with biblical literalism. They tended to take scripture literally. This seems to be a mark among many of the dissenting heretical groups. And for example, Valdensians would not take oaths. They would not swear, as it were, taking an oath, because they took scripture literally on that point. Now, I should tell you that on the European continent, there has been a historiographical debate amongst scholars concerning these heretics. The French scholar Christine Fuselier says that Valdez, and I'll tell you who he was in a moment, Valdez was concerned with poverty, and this led him inevitably to preaching. By contrast, in this debate, the German scholar Kurt Victor Zelga says that no, preaching was the issue, and the Valdensians chose poverty in order to devote themselves to preaching. Well, poverty and preaching, preaching and poverty, which comes first? There's a big debate. It doesn't matter because the debate shows us and centers upon these two P's, preaching and poverty, and these are hallmarks of the Valdensian faith. What are the available sources for the study of the Valdensians? It's a question we should ask ourselves when we come to any historical topic. What sources are scholars relying upon to tell us things that happened hundreds of years ago? So let me just take a moment to share with you some of the sources that are available to scholars who wish to study Valdensianism. Well, we have some chronicles and some narratives. These are fairly general. We have some information in papal registers or conciliar decrees, I mean the acts of councils. There is one book by a Valdensian. It's called A Book Against Heresy, but it's really an attack upon the Cathars, rather than telling us very much about the Valdensians. There are collections of letters, correspondence between German and Italian Valdensians. These date mainly to the 1360s. And then there are inquisitorial records, trial transcripts, interrogation protocols, treatises against the heretics, and this genre of material constitutes our greatest scholarly source in terms of a historical repository. And of course, these qualify as hostile sources. So anytime you're studying history and you're relying upon a document, you need to ask, where did this document come from? Who wrote it? If we don't know who wrote it, well, out of what group did it originate? When? What was the purpose of writing it? And we find that with the heretics, so much of what we know comes from their enemies, from their detractors. And it doesn't take a great deal of brain power to realize that those kinds of sources are going to be colored by the agenda of the author. History is dictated by the victors, not by the losers. The losers get burned. The losers have their books burned. So the only thing we know is what their enemies had to say. And that's a very important lesson for the student of history, and not less the student of church history, to understand and to realize. Now, like the Cathars, who are existing at the same time in the same area of southern France, it does seem that it's southern France that's the birthplace for the Valdensian heresy as well. So let us do the proper thing in a historical investigation and turn our attention first to the context of the city of Lyon, particularly in the later 12th century. And this again, like with the Cathars, will give us some clues and some aids to understanding the whys of the rise of this movement. The socio-economic and political position of Lyon, where the movement began, is essential for understanding the appeal of this new vision for church renewal and reform. And doing history, of course, requires that we pay close attention to context. During the 12th century, Lyon became a prosperous foreign trade center. Major trade routes from Marseille in the south up the Rhone River Valley to Champagne, other routes from southern France into northern Italy crossed at Lyon. Now there's been whole studies about heresy along trade routes. And you wonder why. Because people are moving up and down these routes. There's the exchange not only of trade and goods, but ideas. You want to know what's going on in Italy? You go to a place like Lyon if you can't get to Italy, because the Italian merchants and tradesmen are coming through Lyon, and you find out things. So there's this cosmopolitan feel to Lyon. Merchants used the town as a halfway house, as did other travelers in southern France. Peasants were attracted to the city for a variety of social and economic reasons, and the population grew, becomes an incubator for ideas, and in this case for a movement. There are reasons why the Valdensian teachings will take hold. Of course, I mentioned the peasants coming, the town growing, and there's the usual clear line of demarcation between the urban rich and the poor in Lyon. Remember, the Valdensians are particularly concerned with poverty. The burghers, surprisingly, play very little role in the city government. In fact, it appears that the city is ruled essentially by the Archbishop of Lyon and the cathedral chapter. During the second half of the 12th century, the town becomes the object of a struggle for territorial authority on the part of the princes. And the main protagonists in this struggle appear to involve the episcopate of Lyon, the bishop, the archbishop, the cathedral chapter, the higher churchmen. You see, they're concerned with political power. Today, poison is poured into the church. The Valdensians really stressed the corruption brought into Christianity by the donation of Constantine. And ever since then, bishops and popes have been more concerned with secular power and wealth and affluence than they have been with following Christ. Now, this isn't me talking. I'm speaking as a Valdensian in the 12th and 13th centuries. That's the view they had. Okay. Additional taxes and levies get imposed upon the people because of this social and political and economic conflagration and so on. There's uncertainty in the commercial life in Lyon. And then, would you believe, on top of all of that, ecclesiastical officials, church authorities are getting deposed for political reasons. You see this amalgamation of church and state, and it troubled these early Valdensians. Now, all of this, and I could go on at some length, but that's enough context for our purposes here, it amounts to a power struggle erupting in southern France between the state and the church. It'll have some of the same implications for the Valdensians as it did for the Cathars, and it produced yet another vision of reform and renewal. And that vision is known in the history of Christianity as Valdensianism. Now, we're very fortunate to have several reports on the origins of the heresy and the Valdensian movement. The first report that we have is a 13th century inquisitor's report from the church archive in Carcassonne, and it provides some information that's essential. tells us a man by the name of Peter Valdez, or Waldo, as he is sometimes called in English, is the key player. We don't know when he died, but somewhere between 1205 and 1218. But I need to tell you the name Peter was almost certainly not his Christian name. Its earliest attestation comes from 14th century documents, and so his name was Valdez. We don't know his first name. Now, let me read from this particular inquisitor's report. It comes to us from Carcassonne. You'll notice that he calls the heretics the poor of Lyon. The poor of Lyon had their origins around the year 1170, founded by a certain Lyonese citizen by the name of Valdensius, after whom his followers took their name. The person in question, now listen to this, the person in question was a rich man, but abandoning all of his wealth, he determined to observe a life of poverty and evangelical perfection, as did the apostles. He arranged for the Gospels and some other books of the Bible to be translated in common speech, but also some of the texts of Saints Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, and Gregory, arranged under titles which he called sentences and which he read very often, though without understanding their import. You see the bias of the writer here. He says that Valdez simply didn't understand. Now, infatuated with himself, he presumed to preach the gospel in the streets, where he made many disciples, and involving them, both men and women, in a like presumption by sending them out in turn to preach. These people, ignorant and illiterate, went about the towns, entering houses and even churches, spreading many errors around. At length, summoned by the Archbishop of Lyon, they were forbidden to carry on in such fashion. However, would you believe, you can almost see the exasperation here in the words of the inquisitor, however, they wished by no means to obey him, cloaking their madness, note the language again, by saying that they must obey God rather than men, since God had commanded the apostles to preach the gospel to every creature, and so they ended by despising the prelates and the clergy, accusing them for being rich and for living a life of ease, whereas they applied to themselves what was said to the apostles, whose imitators and successors they boldly declared themselves to be, by a false profession of poverty and feigned image of sanctity. And because of this disobedience and of this presumptuous approbation of a task which did not pertain to them, they were excommunicated and expelled from the country. Well, that's actually quite a nice description of some of the ideas of the Valdensians in their earliest time. A second summary report comes from one by the name of Alain of Lille, who lived between about 1128 and 1202, a Cistercian theologian and leading academic figure of his day. His report is somewhat briefer. The Valdenses are so called from their heresiarch, which is a word meaning an arch-heretic, Valdus, the founder of the new sect who presumed to preach without the authority of a prelate, even without divine inspiration, knowledge, or letters. In other words, he wasn't educated, hadn't gotten any theological training. Alain of Lille goes on, a philosopher without a head, a prophet without vision, an apostle without mission, a teacher without instructor, whose disciples seduce the unwary in different parts of the world. Well, this Valdez had apparently turned the world on its head. Laymen and laywomen now took to the pulpits and the altars of Christendom, and clerics were made to labor in the field as peasant workers, Now, this sometimes happened literally, more often symbolically, and visual images depicted this world upside down. Well, Valdez had this to say in his defense. I have not taken my leave of my senses. I'm not crazy. I'm not out of my mind, as some of you people think I am. But rather, I'll tell you exactly what I'm doing, Valdez said. I'm taking revenge on the enemies who wickedly enslaved me, that made me think and become obsessed with acquiring money rather than seeking after God. I got suckered into a lifestyle which was self-serving and materialistic, and I was encouraged to do this. And many people may think me a fool, but you need to understand, Valdez says, you need to grasp the fact that wealth, of which I have had plenty, is of no importance to me whatsoever. He was austere. He put his 2 daughters in a convent. He threw money onto the streets of Lyon. He saw that his wife was taken care of, and then he swore off his former life for more than 2 months. In the year 1176, during a severe famine, he operated a soup kitchen in Lyon. Well, none of this constitutes heresy. One has to be wondering, for heaven's sake, how did this man come to be regarded as a heresiarch, the arch-heretic? My goodness, he sounds like Francis of Assisi, who did the same thing, who gave up his rich, opulent lifestyle and took up the life of poverty and chastity and obedience to the apostolic vision as he perceived it. Well, it's only from about 1184, no, it's exactly from 1184 that we can call this movement heresy. What happened in 1184? Well, on the 4th day of November, in that year, Pope Lucius III issued a very specific bull known as Ad Abolendum. And this bull included specific sanctions against several heresies, including one that he nominated by name. The poor of Lyon are part of this bunch. The Inquisitor, Bernard of Guy, who we've talked about previously, describes the situation in this way. By arrogantly usurping the office of preachers, they became masters of error. Now, notice that we really haven't been shown any error yet, except that they're preaching when they haven't been given permission. Recall, if I may digress from Guy for a moment, recall that in our discussion of the theory of heresy, contumacy, stubbornness, the refusal to obey was the heart of heresy. Not so much what you were saying or doing, but the fact that you won't obey, the fact that you think you're wiser than the Pope and the cardinals and the councils. And Guy says, yeah, these clowns, these guys have become masters of error because they're doing what they're not supposed to do. When they were forbidden to preach, I'm now citing from Guy, they disobeyed and were declared guilty of contumacy, he uses the word, and were subsequently excommunicated and chased away from their hometowns and country. But in the end, as they remained impenitent, a council held in Rome, even before the Lateran Council, declared them schismatic and condemned them as heretical. Thus, as their numbers on earth grew, they dispersed, separated and cut off from the church, associating instead with other heretics whose errors they adopted. Their own deluded imaginings became mixed up with the errors and the heresies of earlier heretics. Well, yeah, that's a picture, isn't it? That's a portrait. But we haven't been given anything, not a scrap, not a hook to hang our hats on, not a single point of erroneous doctrine save contumacy, that stubbornness to obey. And Guy points it out. He says, their principal heresy, I quote, was and remains contempt for ecclesiastical authority. Well, by the 13th century, the Valdensians have become very well organized. They're settled, they've got schools, they've got hospices, they've got their own cemeteries. They're part of society, just like the Cathars were. And I suggest that it's the situation in southern France that allows for this flourishing of heresy, and indeed, heresy becomes part of the rhythm of life in places like Languedoc. Now, an examination of the adherents of the movement reveals few surprises. The Valdensian faithful were comprised of peasants and artisans, principally, people who'd held occupations like innkeepers and millers, cobblers, tailors, cloth cutters, weavers, hatters, butchers, these sorts of people. Small shopkeepers, barbers, linen weavers. Sometimes there were merchants and nobles, but unlike the Cathars, this was pretty rare. This is more of a grassroots movement. After all, it's pretty tough to get the counts of Toulouse to give up their castles and wealth and adopt a life of voluntary poverty. You could be a Cathar without sacrificing your material affluence. There is extant a description from a chronicle of 1270. They do not accumulate wealth and are content to own little. They lay great store by cleanliness and purity. They eat modestly, and they do not go into inns. Here I suggest we read taverns and or brothels. And they don't attend dances. They avoid besmirchment and shun gossip and lies. Well, these people sound like, well, good old regular Christians, don't they? Practicing a life of separation and obedience, but no, they are heretics. Damnable heretics and schismatics are they. The Englishman Walter Map, who was a justice under King Henry II and later Chancellor of the Bishop of Lincoln, in 1179 he described the Valdensians this way: these people have no dwelling place. They go around 2 by 2, bareheaded and dressed in coarse tunics. They own nothing, sharing everything in common after the manner of the apostles. Naked, they follow the naked Christ. Their beginnings are humble in the extreme, for they have not yet much of a following, but if we should leave them to their devices, they will end by turning all of us out. These people, maybe Walter Map is really saying these people are the real Christians. And if we don't put an end to it, they're going to turn us out. I'm going to lose my chancellorship. I'm going to lose my wealth and my affluence because naked, they follow the naked Christ. And I want to follow Christ with my wagons full of goods behind me. And I know that Jesus said, give all that stuff up and follow me. But this is, after all, the 12th century and times have changed. And it's a wonderful conclusion here. He's really laudatory. He comes to that end, but if we don't do something about it, they're going to turn us all out. Sociologically, the Valdensians were inbred. They were a closed society. They mainly married each other. Valdensians married Valdensians. In Provence, in southern France, 90% of marriages were among Valdensians. But you can understand that. It wouldn't do any good to marry a Cathar or a Catholic or a non-Christian because you run the risk of corrupting the purity of the faith. Now, this popular movement became wandering preachers living in poverty, teaching themselves through vernacular writings, the Bible and the Church Fathers principally. They had these little clandestine books as small as 2.5 inches by 2 1/4 inches, which you could put in your pocket, the original pocket novel, if you will. And these were carried around, and these books emphasized, as did their practices, the social implications of the gospel. By the end of the 14th century, the Valdensian heresy had reached its apex, its climax in terms of its extent and its numbers. We have a document called the Anonymous of Passau, It's a 13th century collection by an unknown author, though clearly a German inquisitor. And he attributes the success of the Valdensians to the fact, this is an inquisitor speaking, to the fact that the official church was in disarray. They're basically saying we're just all messed up, we're in disarray, there's corruption, and they're flourishing because it sort of sounds like they're following the principles of the gospel better than we are. Quite a statement coming from an inquisitor. Peter Zwicker was an itinerant inquisitor in German-speaking territories. He ranged from the Baltic in the north to Hungary in the south. He wrote that the Valdensian heresy flourished while people, and he means Christians, are asleep. And Zwicker was determined that they should flourish no longer. He was going to wake people up and put an end to the heresy. What about their beliefs? I want you to draw a mental comparison between the beliefs of the Valdensians and those of the Cathars, which we looked at previously. What I've done to give some manageability to this is I've extracted from some trial records from 1398 a total of 89 errors. Now, I don't propose to read or to share with you the complete 89 errors from these trials, and they come from Central Europe in the 1390s, but I do want to mention some of them. In brief, they denied confession, these Valdensians. They deny papal authority. They deny purgatory. They say that ecclesiastical vestments are just unnecessary. Priests don't have to be dressed up to celebrate Mass. Doing deeds for the dead, that's just silly. The Virgin Mary is ineffectual. What is the point of carrying on with this cult of the Blessed Virgin Mary? She didn't do anything for you. Okay? Relics and images are simply idolatrous. What nonsense. I mean, you getting a picture of these people? They really want to get Christianity back to its primitive moorings. Let's get rid of all of the trappings of medieval Christianity. Are you starting to understand now why popes and bishops were getting a little bit antsy? We don't need popes. We don't need bishops. I'm going to be out of a job, said the Pope. We've got to do something about these hooligans. Confirmation is invalid. Materialism damns the church. Any building can be a church, they said. Clerical blessings are invalid, not necessary to be ordained. Transubstantiation, foolish. Liturgical music. We don't need liturgical music. Indulgences, pilgrimages, temporal authority is rejected. Monasticism is also dismissed. They reject crusades, and we'll see the irony in this one. They reject the validity of crusades. The Church Fathers are not binding. The Church Fathers are good and salutary to read and understand, but they're not binding. The New Testament is to be understood literally, and of course, we're the true church. The Valdensians, we're the true church. Now, I want to point out that these tenets, and I've only given you a dozen and a half or so, were confirmed as reliable beliefs of Valdensians in numerous trials, and conviction, of course, meant death. We have 2 trial transcripts of Valdensian women that have just become available in English recently. And in terms of women, it's interesting and it's important, I think, to note that they were permitted to exercise leadership in the movement, especially during the early years, particularly in terms of preaching and sacramental consecration. And there were houses of Valdensian sisters living common lives. Like the Cathars, the Valdensian heresy was most often transmitted secretly within the family unit. And once again, this notion of a household, and a household is maybe a better word because there's no such thing as a nuclear family as a concept in the Middle Ages. Household is a better term, but the household, which may not necessarily be biological, was the focus of the particular heresy. Now, enough has already been said, and perhaps too much, for things to remain benign for any longer. If you're a Valdensian in the 13th century, soon The beginnings of persecution will burst like a storm on the heads of the Valdensians, upon the heads of the poor of Lyon. Persecution did ensue in various parts of Europe. The cathedral in Albi in southern France was built. It looks more like a fortress than it does a church, and it was built as a fortress against heresy at this very time. And the bishops who called for its construction made no bones about it, that we are going to move into a siege mentality. And there's a whole bunch of fortified churches in southern France, which you can see to this day. The architecture is suggestive and deliberate. We're going to go to war against these guys, literally and figuratively. The Albigensian crusade against the Cathars certainly affected adversely the Valdensians. And the transfer of the papacy to Avignon in the 14th century certainly gave the higher church authorities the leverage and the location to move against the heartland of the Valdensians. Now, they were never as populous, as numerous as the Cathars, and they were consistently hostile to the Cathars. They didn't buy into Catharism at all. But there were, nonetheless, flourishing Valdensian communities and villages in Provence and in adjoining areas well into the 16th century. Around 1315, Neumeister, interesting name for a Valdensian bishop. He claimed he'd been a bishop for 50 years. He was executed near Vienna. He claimed, did Bishop Neumeister, that there were nearly 80,000 Valdensians in Austria and an infinite number in Bohemia and Moravia. That's clear hyperbole. It's an exaggeration. But there were Valdensians up there in Austria and the Czech lands. And we know by looking at inquisitorial records. Between 1335 and 1355, at least 4,400 people were tried before inquisitorial tribunes in Bohemia. The Gallus of Neuhaus, Neuhaus is the German name for the Czech town of Jindřichův Hradec. Neuhaus is a little bit easier to say, but in Jindřichův Hradec, he was very zealous, Gallus. He attracted equally zealous enemies, of course, and his career came to a sudden and abrupt end as a result of numerous strategic wounds from a dagger. The enemies got to him and the inquisitor was killed. But the history of active persecution against Valdensianism in southern France can be traced to 1369, when the Franciscan Francois Borelli was appointed inquisitor for several dioceses, and he undertook vigorous action against these heretics. Inquisitorial action and activity changed the nature of Valdensian social and religious behavior. Public preaching now ceased. It was too dangerous to be out and about preaching in the streets, in the highways, and in the byways. The Inquisition had come. Of course, no one ever expects the Inquisition, but there they were in southern France. And people became gradually aware that these preachers were illegal. So any association, any listening to them, any affiliation whatsoever, brought you under the same condemnation as the heretics. Remember the anti-heretical legislation. Valdensian preachers were made into criminals and characterized as a menace. And once this happened, those who associated with them became known as friends of heretics, or Valdensians themselves. And once this happened, the movement had to become covert and clandestine, under the cover of night, underground, if you will, in order to survive. And this had three main consequences, I think. One, a principal urban movement became rural. It's easier to go undetected out in the country. Secondly, because of their clandestine nature, lay preachers evolved, called barbies, means uncles in the Piedmontese language, and these barbies basically are the bishops. And you have, thirdly, a diaspora, a dispersion of the Valdensian heresy across Europe. If we examine a map of Valdensian Europe, it reveals definite communities of note in Lombardy, in southern France, in northern Italy, in Germany. We find the communities in Austria, in Bohemia, in Moravia, indeed in the southwest Alps, and in what is today Poland. In fact, I can tell you that only in England, Scandinavia, and the Iberian Peninsula could you not find Valdensians. That's how great the diaspora was. They were European-wide, effectively. Once the church authorities moved against the Valdensians, the first step to put in place was a concerted campaign to discredit. We've done the same thing with the Cathars, and we'll do it with these other heretics we come to. And at length, they too, like the Cathars, were demonized. And we've got visual images surviving from the period showing disgusting practices, the Valdensians getting together for meetings and bringing in the goats and dealing with things that are not very salutary, not very consistent with Christianity. It was all a hogwash. It was all a farce. Even more so for the Valdensians than the Cathars. The term vados, which was often used to describe them, took on several new connotations. It meant heretic in general, but it could also mean sorcerer, depending on its context. It was a term to describe villains. The noun was associated with whore, with harlot, murderer, thief, lust, sodomy, and magic. Now you get the picture here. When you have a term to describe a group of religious reformers that also has these negative connotations, pretty soon the two become melded together. And when you think Waldensian, you think pervert, a magician, a nasty person, sexual immorality. Of course it wasn't true, but it didn't have to be true. You just have to make people believe it. It was Joseph Goebbels, if I might cut to the 20th century, who said if you tell a lie 1,000 times, it becomes truth. And indeed it does. You just keep telling the lies, and pretty soon they're repeated, and after a while you believe them and you don't even know why you believed them. This was part of the most effective tactics of heresy hunting the medieval church came up with. So, the Valdensians are sent by the devil. This is what it's all about. They are like wolves among sheep. I'm quoting now from 13th century sources. They are like murderers coming to destroy. Hide your women and children. These people are coming. The language is revealing, and the image is striking and effective. We have trial records from Freiburg, 1430. Records a street conversation between a Catholic lay woman and a Valdensian, which includes the themes of the devil, preachers of the devil, secrecy, and kissing cats under their tails, which of course was reputed to be done during Valdensian meetings, and linkages to witchcraft. And the Valdensians get pulled right along because the witch hunts will start in the mid-15th century in areas where Valdensians are. And this evoked images of debauchery on a major scale. Reports circulated that the traveling preachers, these Barbies, allowed women to preach. Oh my goodness! Well, they did preach, that was true. That they traveled together, stayed in the same house, shared the same bed. One of the reports we have from 1180, two Waldensian preachers, women, are reported to have said, "We preach all day, we eat all evening, and we screw different men all night." That's putting it nicely from the way it's in the source. And so these rumors of promiscuous sexual activity began to multiply against the Valdensians in much the same way they did against the Cathars, though again, I repeat, there is far less evidence to suggest this sort of misconduct on the part of the Valdensians. In Austria, it was reported that the Valdensians were said to actually marry their siblings, and that sexual sins were overlooked by God if they were done underground. Now, all of this was slanderous. All of it was provocative, and it was thus intended to be slanderous and provocative. Tell the lie 1,000 times. Soon it'll be accepted as truth. Little of it can be relied upon. If you do the research, little can be relied upon, but it served a purpose. Just like political propaganda today in our newspapers, it serves a purpose to galvanize a movement, to take care of whatever it is that you feel is the dominant threat. Tell the lie, it'll become truth. It just needs a little bit of time in which to incubate. Now, as for the involvement of women, which so scandalized the church, of course, Valdez himself had encouraged converted prostitutes to become preachers. I mean, why not? They've been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. They've taken on Jesus Christ. What difference does it make that they were prostitutes before they got saved? They're now saved. They're filled with the Spirit of Jesus. They should preach because we're all preachers to take the gospel into all the world. And of course you can see that you could take what he was doing and twist it to say, look, he's recruiting prostitutes to proclaim what he's trying to proclaim. And it takes on a completely different meaning from the intention. People were encouraged to report on the heretics. In the Bohemian town of České Budějovice, witnesses claimed that when the host was elevated during the Mass, the heretics wouldn't look. They'd avert their eyes because they didn't believe in this transubstantiation. So now get down to the inquisitor's office just after church and say, yes, now I saw so-and-so turn his eyes when the host was elevated, and I also saw 2 people over in the corner there who didn't take communion. Aha! So then the process of inquisition begins. Inquisitors used different methods to subdue the heresy. Bernard Guy and Gallus of Neuhaus, both of whom I've mentioned, used terror and force. Peter's vicar used preaching and persuasion. Reports were made at the Council of Basel in the year 1432 that Valdensians were raising money to help finance the Hussite cause, which was going on at the very same time. And in fact, in 1433, Hussites would appear at the Council of Constance, or at the Council of Basel, but that's a different story. It is evident that Valdensian communities did in fact use Hussite writings. Now we've got a big problem on our hands. There is some connection. The church began to fear that there was an international heretical conspiracy. Oh my goodness, what are we going to do? We've got Cathars running amok, we've got Hussites popping up all over the place in Central Europe, and we've got Valdensians everywhere. We have got to have a meeting. We have got to come up with an agenda. We better give the Inquisition a call. We have got to deal with these people. So, another chapter in the campaign to eradicate this heresy took place in 1487 and 1488. Short-lived, but the fallout lasted for 2 decades. This was the Valdensian Crusade. Now, not too many people know about the Valdensian Crusade. We know about the Crusades, we know about the Albigensian Crusades, and you'll hear about the Hussite Crusades, but the Valdensian Crusade is a very small chapter, but letters issued by Pope Innocent VIII in 1487 and a bull of the same year authorized the Archdeacon of Cremona, a man by the name of Alberto Cattaneo, to proceed against heretics in the Dauphiné, Savoy, and Piedmont. This was the authorization of a crusade in the official sense. In fact, the duty was placed incumbent upon the authorities that aiding the crusade with force of arms was regarded as a religious duty by local Catholics. Those who participated would have a plenary indulgence for the remission of all of their sins. But soon the crusades disintegrated into raids of plunder. The crusade followed secular rather than religious boundaries. They sent a Franciscan preacher up in August 1487 to try and persuade the heretics to avoid this coming storm of violence, to repent. Heretics were cited by name a month later to come for an interrogation and sentence. Those who didn't were excommunicated and sentenced in absentia to death. But the winter prevented much activity in terms of the crusade. I mean, have you been to the Alps in the winter? There's a lot of snow up there. So they had to wait till spring 1488, when the snow started to melt. The Crusaders invaded. The Valdensians tried to defend themselves. They hid in the caves of the Alps with crossbows and small firearms. When the caves were stormed, life, of course, was lost on both sides. Estimates range that from 160 to 400 Valdensians were killed. That would be about close to 20% of the heretics in that area, which is a fair substantial loss to sustain in a single campaign. The crusade was typical, as crusades always are. No regard for age or gender. Suspected heretics were simply hanged. They were run through with the sword. They were thrown headlong from cliffs en masse. Suspected heretics were locked up in buildings that were burned down over their heads. And in many cases, financial extortion occurred. If you had any means, which Valdensians really didn't, you could buy your way out. A 6-volume dossier of the crusade survives only in volumes 1 and 6. As late as the 15th century, there are lingering reports of Valdensians continuing to live in caves to avoid detection and violence. These people are really a fine example, a classic example of the would-be reformer and a would-be reform group drawn into heresy because of the inadequacy of the church. These were not heretics. These people wanted renewal and reform. The church couldn't handle it. And as a result, by the mid-15th century, the Valdensians, as I mentioned previously, were considerably less urban-based than they had been a century earlier. They were dispersed throughout Europe. And at the end of the Middle Ages, hostile writers continued to comment, despite its being condemned, the said sect still persevered, and like the snake, which slithers secretly, and the fox which lurks in its den, it has lasted. And though dismissed by people like Étienne de Bourbon and Bernard Guy as ignorant and illiterate, of all the late medieval heresies in Europe, and there were quite a few, the Strigalniki in Russia, the Cathars in Languedoc, Hussites in Bohemia, the Lollards in England, and the Valdensians, only the latter survive the test and trials and persist to the present. Efforts were made to eradicate the poor of Lyon. But as Tertullian once put it so aptly some 1,800 years ago, the blood of the martyr is seed. And today, in 2005, Valdensians can be found in Germany, in Uruguay, in Argentina, in Italy, and in the United States. They have, ironically, a seminary, a theological training school for their ministers in Rome, not far from St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City, where once efforts were made so strenuously to wipe them from the face of the earth. But Valdez and his followers never forgot something that Jesus said a long time ago. Upon this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The Valdensians survived.